The silence in the Moretti dining room was a specific vintage. It was not the comfortable silence of old friends, nor the anticipatory hush of a theater. It was the kind of silence that is curated, expensive, and heavy as a slab of marble. It was a silence held in place by the sheer gravitational force of Isabella Moretti, who sat at the head of the long, polished mahogany table like a queen enthroned. Her hair, a severe silver helmet, caught the light from the chandelier, which dripped crystals over them like frozen tears. Ilara felt the weight of that silence in her bones. It pressed on her chest, making the simple act of breathing feel like a transgression. She kept her eyes fixed on her plate, a mosaic of porcelain and untouched food. The scallops, she was sure, were perfect. The risotto, probably creamy and divine. But the muscles in her throat had seized. Each beat of her heart was a loud, vulgar drum against the room's oppressive quiet. She had known this would be difficult. Dante had warned her, in his own spare way. "My mother has standards," he had said, his voice a low thrum that seemed to vibrate in the very air around him. It was a masterpiece of understatement. Isabella Moretti did not have standards. She was the architect of a brutal social hierarchy, and she was its only occupant at the summit. Ilara risked a glance across the table. Dante sat opposite her, his stillness a perfect counterpoint to his mother's rigid tension. He was not looking at her. His gaze was directed towards the far end of the table where his father, the old Don, sat in a haze of memory and fine brandy. Dante's face was a study in calm neutrality, but Ilara, who was becoming a scholar of his micro-expressions, saw the minute tightening at the corner of his eye. He was listening. He was always listening. "So," Isabella's voice cut through the silence, sharp and cold as a shard of glass. "Dante tells me you are a librarian." The word was delivered as if it were an accusation, something distasteful she had found on the sole of her shoe. Several cousins and uncles seated along the length of the table shifted, their silverware making tiny, nervous sounds against their plates. "Not exactly," Ilara said. Her own voice sounded thin, a fragile thread in the tapestry of the room's hostility. "I'm a conservator. I specialize in the restoration of rare books and manuscripts." Isabella arched a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Ah, you fix old books." "I preserve history," Ilara corrected, so a spark of defiance she could not quite suppress. "I give voice to things that have been silent for a long time." A flicker of something, interest, annoyance, passed over Isabella's face. "How poetic. And what of your family, child? What history do they preserve?" This was the real interrogation, the one Ilara had been dreading. Her own history was not one of palatial estates and curated silence. It was a history of worn linoleum, of second shifts and third-hand clothes, of a mother who worked her fingers to the bone, and a father who had disappeared into a fog of cheap whiskey and regret. It was a history she had fought tooth and nail to climb out of, not because she was ashamed of it, but because the world was relentlessly cruel to those who carried its weight. "My family is from the Midwest," Ilara began, choosing her words with the care of a diplomat navigating a minefield. "They were good, hard-working people." Past tense. The truth was easier that way. "Were?" Isabella pounced. "They are no longer with us?" "My mother passed away several years ago," Ilara said, the familiar ache a dull throb behind her sternum. "My father, we are not in contact." "I see." Two words, laden with a universe of judgment. Isabella took a delicate sip of her wine, her dark eyes pinning Ilara to her chair. No family, no connections. A restorer of old things with no history of her own to speak of. "Tell me, Dante," she said, turning her head with theatrical slowness to face her son. "What is it you find so fascinating about this girl? What does she bring to this family, to this table?" The room held its breath. Dante did not move for a long moment. He finished the wine in his glass, a slow, deliberate motion. He placed the glass down on the white linen tablecloth without a sound. The kind of silence that doesn't echo, the kind that settles. "She brings peace, Mother," he said. His voice was low, but it carried the unmistakable timbre of command. It was a voice that did not need to be raised to be obeyed. It was steady as iron wrapped in silk. Isabella let out a short, incredulous laugh. It was not a sound of mirth. It was the sound of a lock being broken. "Peace? We are not at war, Dante. We are the Morettis. We have power. We have influence. We require strength, alliances, lineage." She gestured with a dismissive wave of her hand toward Ilara. "This girl, she is a ghost. She has nothing. She is nobody." "She's nobody." The words hung in the air, brutal and absolute. Ilara felt the blood drain from her face. It was not the insult that wounded her. It was the casual, effortless cruelty of it, the complete erasure. In that moment, she was not a person to Isabella Moretti. She was a line item that did not balance, a variable that needed to be deleted. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, a mixture of pity, morbid curiosity, and cold agreement. She did not scream. She did not cry. She simply sat there, encased in a sudden, chilling numbness, her quiet dignity the only shield she had left. She thought about the years of study. She thought about the painstaking hours spent with a single crumbling page, her breath held so as not to disturb the fragile ink. She thought about her small apartment, the one she had furnished with her own hard-earned money. A quiet sanctuary filled with the scent of old paper and beeswax. She thought about the first time she had met Dante when he had come to her workshop seeking to have an ancient family ledger restored. He had not swaggered. He had not boasted. He had stood in the dusty sunlight of her studio and simply watched her work, his attention as intense and focused as her own. He had seen her, really seen her, or so she had thought. Now, under the glare of his mother's hatred, she felt that connection fraying. She felt herself shrinking, becoming the nobody Isabella had declared her to be. Her hands, usually so steady, began to tremble in her lap. The weight was too much. The silence was too heavy. She had endured so much in her life, but this public dissection, this cold, clinical vivisection of her worth, was a new kind of violation. She had to get out, but before she could move, before she could formulate a plan to excuse herself and flee into the cold night, a sound broke the spell. It was the sound of a chair, solid and heavy, pushing back from the table. Every head turned. Dante stood up. He did not rush. He was not performing. His movements were economical, precise, imbued with a gravity that seemed to bend the very light in the room towards him. The ambient chatter from the far end of the table died instantly. Even the clinking of a distant fork ceased. The entire universe of the Moretti dining room had contracted to this single point of action. He looked at his mother. His face was unreadable, a mask of aristocratic calm. But his eyes, dark and deep, held a cold fire that made Isabella's imperious expression falter for the briefest of moments. So he had not updated the file. He was working from a version of his mother that had never been accurate in its assessment of his limits. Then he turned his gaze from his mother and looked at Ilara. And in his eyes she did not see pity. She did not see apology. She saw acknowledgement. He saw her terror, her humiliation, her quiet strength, and he was not looking away. It was a look that said, "I see you. Stay with me." He began to walk, not towards his mother to argue, not towards the door to leave, but around the vast expanse of the mahogany table, directly towards her. His steps were measured, unhurried, each one landing with the finality of a judge's gavel. The other family members seemed to shrink in their chairs as he passed, their own importance fading in his wake. He was a sovereign moving through his court. And his purpose was absolute. He stopped beside her chair. The scent of him, clean wool, expensive cologne, and something else, something uniquely Dante, like old leather and cold steel, enveloped her. She looked up at him, her heart a trapped bird beating against her ribs. He reached into the breast pocket of his impeccably tailored charcoal suit. For a wild second, she thought he might be retrieving a weapon, a phone, a wallet. But his fingers emerged not with cold metal or black leather, but with a small velvet box. It was the color of midnight. He did not kneel. Kneeling was for supplicants, for performers. Dante Moretti did not supplicate. He opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of black silk, was a ring. It was not a gaudy bauble. It was a single, flawless sapphire, the color of a twilight sky, outflanked by two discreet but substantial diamonds. It was old, elegant, and it pulsed with an authority all its own. Ilara recognized the setting from a book she had once studied on Renaissance jewelers. It was a ring that signified more than betrothal. It was a signet of power. He took the ring from the box. His fingers, warm and steady, brushed against hers as he reached for her left hand. She did not pull away. She could not. She was mesmerized by the sheer, audacious finality of his actions. He gently took her hand, turning it over. He looked down at her fingers, which were stained with a faint trace of pigment from a 17th century manuscript she had been working on that afternoon. A ghost of a smile so small it was almost invisible touched his lips. Then, in the crushing, absolute silence of the room, as his mother watched with a face that had gone from imperious to aghast, Dante Moretti slid the ring onto Ilara's finger. It was a perfect fit. He did not say, "Will you marry me?" He did not ask a question at all. He simply placed the ring on her finger, a quiet, definitive act. Then he leaned down, his lips close to her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "Now," he murmured, his voice so low it was for her alone, a private treaty in a world of public warfare. "You are somebody. You are my somebody. And nobody." He paused, his gaze lifting to meet his mother's across the room, a silent declaration of war. "Will ever speak to you that way again." The aftermath was not an explosion, but an implosion. The magnificent, tension-filled structure of the evening collapsed in on itself. Isabella Moretti's face, a moment before a mask of horrified shock, hardened into a rictus of pure fury. Color flooded her pale cheeks, a blotchy, unbecoming red. Her mouth opened, then closed, no sound emerging. For the first time in what was likely decades, the matriarch was speechless, robbed of the weapon she wielded with such mastery. Dante straightened up, his hand resting for a single, possessive second on Ilara's shoulder. It was not a gesture of comfort. It was a gesture of ownership, of demarcation, a flag planted on newly claimed territory. He turned to face the room, his expression once again a placid, unreadable mask. "The evening is concluded," he announced. It was not a suggestion. It was a decree. An uncle sputtered halfway through a bite of tiramisu. A cousin froze, her wine-glass suspended in mid-air. They looked from Dante to Isabella and back again, their faces a tableau of confusion and fear. They were witnessing a tectonic shift in the family's power structure, and no one knew where the new fault lines would settle. Dante's father, the old Don, who had been silent all night, slowly lowered his brandy snifter. He looked at the ring on Ilara's finger. He looked at his son's implacable face. Then he looked at his wife's barely contained rage. A slow, knowing smile spread across his weathered features. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a sign of approval, of succession. Dante ignored them all. His focus was singular. He extended a hand to Ilara. "Come," he said, the single word a lifeline in the churning sea of family drama. Her hand, now adorned with the heavy, significant weight of the sapphire, felt alien to her. She placed it in his. His grip was firm, warm, and utterly certain. He pulled her gently to her feet. The emerald silk of her dress, a dress she had spent a month's savings on to feel worthy of this evening, swished around her ankles. She felt like an actress who had been thrust onto a stage in the middle of a play for which she had no script. Dante did not lead her out of the dining room. He led her through a discreet door behind the long brocade curtains, a door she hadn't even known was there. It opened into a quiet, wood-paneled corridor lit by small shaded sconces. The cacophony of the dining room, the shocked silence, the aborted conversations, was instantly muted, replaced by the soft echo of their footsteps on a worn Persian runner. They walked without speaking. Ilara's mind was a whirlwind of sapphire blue, shocked faces, and the low, possessive timbre of Dante's voice in her ear. He was leading her deeper into the labyrinth of the estate, this fortress of old money and older secrets. The corridor opened into a vast two-story library. It was Ilara's version of heaven. Ladders on rolling tracks lined shelves that soared towards a coffered ceiling. The air smelled of aging paper, leather, and wood smoke from a low fire crackling in a stone fireplace large enough to stand in. It was a room built for thought, for sanctuary. It was Dante's personal domain. He led her to a pair of worn leather armchairs near the fire, the deep burgundy of the leather glowing in the warm light. He did not release her hand until she was seated. Then he moved to a small inlaid table where a decanter of amber liquid and 2 glasses sat waiting. He was always prepared. His entire life was a series of anticipated moves, of contingencies planned for and executed. He poured 2 glasses, the sound of the liquid a gentle whisper in the quiet room. He handed one to her. Her fingers were still trembling. The crystal was heavy and cool. "This is not how I intended this evening to go," he said, taking the seat opposite her. He did not drink. He simply held the glass, his long fingers curled around it, studying her over the rim. Ilara found her voice, though it felt rusty from disuse. "You intended to propose to me in front of your entire family without ever having discussed it with me?" The words were sharper than she intended, laced with a hysteria that was bubbling just beneath the surface of her shock. He considered this for a moment. No. The proposal was a strategic adjustment. A response to an unforeseen escalation. A strategic adjustment. He had not updated the file. He was working from a version of her that had never been accurate. These modern, corporate metaphors he used to describe his life were both chilling and, in a strange way, comforting. They framed the chaos in a logical structure she could almost understand. "You can't just do that, Dante," she said, her voice dropping. "You can't just decide that I'm yours and put a ring on my finger. This isn't the 18th century. I am not a piece of property to be claimed." "I agree," he said, without a hint of defensiveness. His calm was infuriating. "You are not property. You are an asset, the most valuable one I have ever encountered, and I protect my assets." "I don't need your protection," she snapped, the fire in the hearth suddenly feeling too hot. The room too close. She stood up, needing to move, to pace. "I have been taking care of myself for a very long time. And you have done an extraordinary job of it," he said, his voice soft, disarming her anger. "You have built a life, a career, a reputation for integrity and excellence from nothing. I know this. I have studied it." She stopped pacing. "Studied it?" He nodded, finally taking a sip of his drink. "Ilara, you and I did not meet by chance. The ledger I brought to you for restoration, it was a test." She stared at him, bewildered. "A test? What are you talking about?" "That ledger," he said, leaning forward, his dark eyes intense, "was one of 3 known to exist. It details the founding of my family's enterprises in the New World. Why, one of the other copies was altered decades ago to erase a branch of the family that was betrayed and cut out. The 3rd is a perfect forgery, created by our rivals to sow discord. I brought you the original, the true one, to see what you would find." Ilara's mind raced back. She remembered the ledger. The vellum was brittle, the iron gall ink faded. She had spent weeks analyzing it, her work slow and meticulous. She remembered finding the inconsistencies, a slight change in the chemical composition of the ink on 2 pages, a subtle difference in the pressure of the penmanship, the ghost of an erased name visible only under ultraviolet light. She had noted it all in her report, a detailed 20-page document she had submitted with the restored book. She had assumed he'd never even read it. The name, she whispered. The one that was almost completely gone? Bellini! Dante's expression was grim. My grandmother's family. They were partners. My grandfather, driven by ambition and the counsel of men who wished him ill, erased them, financially, and in some cases, literally. Your work confirmed the truth I had long suspected. It gave me the proof I needed. Proof for what? To make things right. I have spent the last 6 months quietly acquiring the Bellini family's lost assets, tracking down their descendants, and preparing to restore their name and their fortune. Your report was the key that unlocked it all. You did not just fix an old book, Ilara. You uncovered a wound in the heart of my family's history. You gave voice to the silent. He used her own words, turning them back to her, imbuing them with a weight she had never intended. So she sank back into the chair, the brandy glass trembling in her hand. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Her quiet, academic work, her solitary passion, had been a crucial move in a game she didn't even know was being played. So all of this, was because I was useful to you? The thought was a cold stone in her stomach. No, he said, his voice dropping again into that low, intimate register. It began because you were useful. It became something else. I watched you work. I read your notes. I saw the care, the integrity, the respect you have for the truth, however small or forgotten. In a world of loud, grasping people, you are quiet. You are patient. You are meticulous. My mother looks at you and sees nothing because she only values volume. I look at you and I see the most capable person in every room you enter. The disorienting relief of being seen. It was a feeling so potent it almost made her dizzy. For years, her competence had been a quiet, internal knowledge. To have it recognized, articulated, and valued by a man like Dante was both terrifying and intoxicating. My mother's words tonight were not just an insult, Ilara, he continued, his tone hardening. In our world, they were a threat. By declaring you a nobody, she made you a target. She marked you as disposable, unprotected. Any rival, any ambitious underling would see you as a vulnerability, a way to get to me. My mother knows this. She did it on purpose. He stood and walked to the fireplace, resting one arm on the mantel. He looked into the flames. I could not allow that declaration to stand. I had to countermand it, immediately, publicly. In our world, there are few things more binding than a matriarch's curse, except for a Don's vow. By putting that ring on your finger, I did not claim you. I shielded you. I made you untouchable. I have declared to my world and to any enemies we may have that you are now under the full protection of the Moretti family, that an insult to you is an insult to me, that a threat to you is a declaration of war. He turned from the fire to face her. The flickering light cast his face in stark relief, all sharp angles and deep shadows. He looked like a Renaissance prince, burdened and dangerous. The ring is a shield, Ilara, not a cage. It is a statement of fact, my fact. It ensures your safety while you are in my world. What it means to us privately, that is a conversation we can have. For as long as it takes. He walked back to her and crouched down in front of her chair, bringing him to her level. It was the first time she had ever seen him in a position that was not one of utter dominance. It was, she realized, a gesture of profound respect. I am sorry for the shock, he said, his voice quiet. I am sorry for my mother. I am sorry you were hurt. Not because he was sorry, because he was caught. No, this was different. This was real. But I am not sorry for what I did. It was necessary. It is handled. She looked down at the sapphire on her finger. It glowed with a deep inner light, as if it had absorbed the fire from the hearth. A shield. A statement. She thought of Isabella's cruel, dismissive face. She thought of the tremor in her own hands, the feeling of being erased. And then she thought of the absolute, unshakable certainty in Dante's eyes as he had walked towards her. She was in a world she did not understand, bound to a man of terrifying power by an act of public theater. She was frightened, she was disoriented, but for the first time all night, she felt safe. She looked at him, really looked at him, there at her feet, the quiet sovereign, the ruthless protector. "Okay," she whispered, the single word feeling inadequate and yet, somehow, all-encompassing. "Okay, Dante, what comes next?" The days that followed were a study in disorientation. Ilara was moved with the swift and silent efficiency that seemed to define all of Dante's operations, from her small sunlit apartment into a suite of rooms within the Moretti estate. It was not the main house where Isabella's fury was now a low, simmering poison, but a separate wing connected by a glassed-in colonnade that overlooked a series of formal gardens. Her new rooms were beautiful, of course. Everything in Dante's world was beautiful. They were spacious and airy, with tall windows, pale oak floors, and furniture that was a masterpiece of minimalist luxury. But it was the room he showed her last that made her breath catch. He had converted a large, north-facing conservatory into a state-of-the-art workshop. There were long oak tables, perfectly calibrated lighting, a humidity-controlled cabinet for delicate papers, and rows upon rows of empty shelves waiting to be filled. He had even managed to have her own tools, her specialized presses, and her personal collection of reference books transported from her old life and arranged with meticulous care. I assumed you would want to continue your work," he said, standing in the doorway as she walked through the space in a daze. She ran her hand over the smooth, cool surface of a granite worktop. It was more than she had ever allowed herself to dream of. It was a cage, but it was a gilded one, and its bars were made of professional respect. This was the paradox of her new reality. She was a captive, yet she was being given the tools for more freedom in her work than she had ever known. "This is," she started, but the words failed her. "Adequate," he supplied, a hint of dry wit in his tone. She turned to him. "It's overwhelming." "Good. I was aiming for overwhelming." He leaned against the doorframe, his hands in the pockets of his trousers, the picture of casual power. "This is yours, Ilara. No one will disturb you here. You can work, or you can read, or you can simply sit and stare out at the gardens. The choice is yours." The first few days, she did little else. She was processing. The sheer velocity of the change in her circumstances was giving her a kind of emotional whiplash. She would wake up in a bed with sheets that felt like spun silk, eat breakfast brought by a silent housekeeper who never quite met her eye, and then retreat to the sanctuary of the workshop. She felt the weight of the sapphire on her finger, a constant, heavy reminder of her new, complicated status. She was angry at Dante for his high-handedness, for making a decision of this magnitude about her life without her consent, angry at Isabella for her cruelty, angry at herself for the part of her that felt a profound, bone-deep relief at no longer having to fight so hard just to exist. Fear of dependency warred with the simple gratitude for protection. On the fourth day, she decided she had had enough of her own circular thoughts. She unpacked her tools. She arranged her pigments and chemicals. She began to work. She started with a simple task, rebinding a collection of 19th century poetry that had belonged to Dante's grandmother. As her hands moved through the familiar, precise motions, folding paper, stitching signatures, tooling leather, the noise in her head began to quiet. This, she knew. This was her power. The quiet, patient, meticulous restoration of what was broken. Dante, for his part, was a master of restraint. He did not crowd her. He did not make demands. He would appear in the late afternoons, a silent presence in the doorway of her workshop, a glass of wine or a cup of tea in hand for her. He would simply watch her work for a few minutes, his expression thoughtful, before delivering a brief report on his day. "The logistics for the Bellini restoration are in place," he might say. Or, "I had a conversation with the head of the museum. He is amenable to a new endowment for their conservation department, under your direction, if you wish." These were not questions. They were offerings. He was building a world around her, a world where her skills were not just appreciated, but given institutional power. He was using his vast resources not to control her, but to empower her, albeit on his own terms. It was a subtle, brilliant, and deeply unsettling strategy. Their evenings fell into a quiet routine. They would eat dinner together, not in the cavernous dining room of the main house, but in a small private study off the library. The food was simple, the conversation often sparse. He would ask about her work, his questions surprisingly technical and insightful. She, in turn, began to ask about his. She learned to read the subtle language of his business. When he spoke of supply chain logistics, she understood it meant negotiating with other families over shipping routes. Aggressive acquisitions meant hostile takeovers of rival territory or businesses. He ran his criminal empire like a Fortune 500 company with a chilling degree of efficiency and a complete lack of sentimentality. Mostly. One evening, as she was describing a particularly difficult process of removing acidic tape from a medieval manuscript, she looked up and found him staring at her with an unnerving intensity. "What?" she asked, a little self-conscious. "You're beautiful when you're talking about vellum," he said, the statement so unexpected and direct that she felt a blush creep up her neck. "Don't," she said automatically. "Don't what? State an observation? Don't try to flatter me. I'm not one of your business partners." He put his fork down. "Alara, I have never once lied to you. I don't intend to start now. I find the way your mind works to be the most compelling thing I have ever encountered. The fact that your face is also aesthetically pleasing is simply a fortunate coincidence." His utter seriousness was more disarming than any flowery compliment. This was the slow burn. The relationship was not being built on passion or whirlwind romance, but on a foundation of mutual recognition. He saw her competence. She was beginning to see the man beneath the terrifyingly calm exterior. She saw the weight he carried, the isolation of his position. He was the quiet sovereign, and it was a lonely throne to occupy. Meanwhile, Isabella was not idle. She had been banished from the main house, not physically, but psychically. Dante's quiet coup had stripped her of her role as the family's primary power broker. She was now just a dowager queen, her pronouncements carrying no weight, her authority gone. She seethed. From her own opulent suite, she began to make calls. She was working from an old playbook, one that had served her well for 40 years. If the girl could not be dismissed, she must be destroyed. "Find out everything!" she snarled into the phone to a private investigator she kept on a discreet retainer. Her childhood, her schooling, any debts, any lovers, every mistake she has ever made. I want it all. There is always something. No one is that clean. She was convinced Alara was a grifter, a brilliant actress who had somehow bewitched her pragmatic son. Give her 3 days, she had thought. She'll be begging to come back. When that didn't happen, her rage curdled into a cold, obsessive fury. Dante was making a fool of himself, of the family. He was choosing this nobody, over his own mother, over tradition, over strength. The investigator was good. He dug deep. But Alara's life, as it turned out, was disappointingly scandal-free. She had worked hard, paid her bills, and kept to herself. There was, however, one thing, a shadow from her distant past. A student loan from her undergraduate degree that, due to a predatory lender and a period of unemployment after her mother's death, had ballooned into a crippling, unmanageable sum. Alara had been paying it down, bit by agonizing bit, for years. It was her secret shame, the financial sword that had always hung over her head. The investigator also found a name, a man from her college years, a brief, regrettable relationship that had ended badly. Nothing dramatic, just the usual messiness of youth. Isabella seized on these 2 threads with glee. A debtor and a jilted lover. It was not the grand scandal she had hoped for, but it was a start. It was leverage. She began to formulate a plan. a way to expose the girl for the cheap opportunist she was, to humiliate her so publicly that Dante would have no choice but to cast her aside. Her fatal miscalculation was a simple one, born of pure arrogance. She believed she was acting in secret. She believed her son, distracted by his new infatuation, was not paying attention. Section. She had no idea that Dante's quiet actions were always several moves ahead of everyone else's. His information network was not a gossipy web of retainers. It was a deep, structural part of his organization. The private investigator Isabella hired? He had been on Dante's payroll for a decade, his loyalty absolute. The report that was delivered to Isabella was a carefully edited version of the truth. The full, unredacted report was delivered to Dante first. Dante sat in his library, the fire crackling, and read about the crippling debt Alara had been carrying in silence for years. He read about her struggle, her refusal to declare bankruptcy, her dogged determination to pay what she owed, even when it was unjust. His expression did not change, but a cold, hard anger settled in his chest. An anger directed not at Alara, but at a world that would place such a burden on someone so worthy. He made a single phone call. The next morning, a wire transfer for the full, inflated amount of the loan, plus a punitive 7-figure inconvenience fee, was deposited into the accounts of the predatory lending company. It was followed by a visit from 2 of Dante's lawyers who explained in very calm, very clear terms that the company's charter was now under review for predatory practices, and that it would be in their best interest to confirm the debt as paid in full and erase all records of Alara's name. They agreed, instantly. He was not just solving a problem, he was eradicating it from history. Isabella, meanwhile, was preparing for her grand move. She chose her stage with care, the family's annual Obsidian Gala, a lavish charity event that served as the Moretti's primary public relations vehicle. It was a night where the city's elite, politicians, judges, financiers, came to pay tribute, to see and be seen. It was the apex of the Moretti's social power, and it was Isabella's traditional domain. It would be the perfect place to spring her trap. She leaked a carefully worded item to a gossip columnist about Dante's mysterious new fiancé, hinting at a troubled past. She arranged for the old boyfriend, a weak-willed man now working in middle management, to be given a ticket to the gala. She held the information about the debt close, ready to deploy it at the moment of maximum impact. She was a general preparing for a battle she was certain she would win. She did not know the war was already over. The night of the Obsidian Gala arrived, draped in the cold, glittering promise of a late autumn evening. The venue was the city's grandest museum, its soaring marble halls transformed for the night into a forest of black linens, shimmering crystal, and blood-red roses. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of powerful people making powerful conversation. Ilara stood at the top of the grand staircase, her hand resting lightly on Dante's arm. She wore a gown the color of midnight, a simple, or architecturally precise column of silk that left her shoulders bare. The Moretti sapphire on her finger seemed to drink the light, its deep blue a stark contrast to the diamond necklace that lay cool against her skin. A gift from Dante, delivered to her room an hour earlier with a simple note. A shield needs armor. She was terrified, not of the crowds, but of the role she was being asked to play. Every smile felt like a lie, every polite nod an act of theater. But as she looked at Dante beside her, his presence a bastion of calm in the swirling chaos, she found a strange sense of resolve. She would not let him down. She would not let Isabella win. "Ready?" he murmured, his voice a low vibration she felt more than heard. "No," she answered, with a sliver of the dry wit she was starting to learn from him. "But I don't leave because things become complicated." A rare, genuine smile touched his lips. "Good, that's my line." They descended the staircase, a slow royal procession. A hush fell over the hall. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. All eyes turned to them. This was the power shift made manifest. They were not just a couple, they were an event. Dante, the quiet sovereign, and the mysterious woman who wore his ring. Isabella watched them from across the room, her face a mask of cold triumph. She stood with a cluster of the family's oldest and most influential allies, her silver gown shimmering like dragon scales. She saw the stares, the whispers. Perfect. The stage was set. She let them circulate for an hour, a cat allowing a mouse the illusion of freedom. She watched as Dante introduced Ilara to judges and senators, his pride in her a quiet, palpable thing. It only fueled Isabella's rage. He was a fool, blinded by a pretty face and a fabricated story of competence. She would save him from himself. The moment came, as she knew it would. Dante was pulled away by the mayor for a private word. Ilara was left momentarily alone, near a towering ice sculpture of a swan. It was then that Isabella made her move. "My dear," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness as she glided up to Ilara. "You look lovely, so unspoiled." Ilara's spine stiffened. She turned, her expression carefully neutral. "Isabella, it's a beautiful party." "I have always had a talent for creating beauty," Isabella said, her eyes scanning the room. "And for sweeping away that which is unsightly." Her gaze landed on a nervous-looking man in an ill-fitting tuxedo, hovering near the champagne fountain. "Do you know, I believe an old friend of yours is here tonight, a Mr. Peterson from your university days." Ilara's blood ran cold. Mark Peterson. The name was a ghost from a life she had long since buried. She glanced over and saw him, his face slick with sweat, his eyes darting around nervously. He looked like a man who had been paid to be somewhere he did not belong. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean," Ilara said, her voice steady. Isabella laughed, a low, cruel sound. "Oh, I think you do, but perhaps your memory is as selective as your history. Some people might think it's a bit unseemly for a woman about to marry into one of the country's most prominent families to have such loose ends, not to mention such significant financial obligations." She had played her card. The word obligations hung in the air between them. It was a threat, clear and sharp, but Ilara did not flinch. She did not panic. She simply looked at the woman who was trying to destroy her, and for the first time, she did not see a terrifying matriarch. She saw a desperate, petty tyrant, her power a hollow, performed thing. Ilara thought of the quiet strength of Dante's hand in hers, of the workshop he had built for her, of the respect in his eyes when he watched her work. "You are mistaken, Isabella," Ilara said, her voice quiet but firm. "I have no outstanding obligations." It was at that moment that Dante returned. He did not rush. He simply appeared at Ilara's side, a dark, silent shadow. He placed a hand on the small of her back, a gesture of both possession and support. "Mother," he said. His voice was dangerously calm. "So you seem to be bothering my fiancé." "Dante, darling." Isabella's tone was bright, brittle. "I was just welcoming Ilara and catching up. We were just discussing her past." She gave him a look heavy with meaning, a look that said, "See? I have the weapon. Now you must do as I say." Dante looked from his mother's triumphant face to Ilara's calm one. He then let his gaze drift over to Mark Peterson, who looked as if he might faint. "Ah, yes," Dante said. "Her past. I find it endlessly fascinating." He turned to Isabella, his eyes cold as chips of obsidian. "You have been busy, mother, making calls, hiring investigators, trying to find a lever to pull." Isabella's smile faltered. "I don't know what you're talking about. I was merely doing my due diligence. For the good of the family." "The family?" Dante's voice dropped, losing all warmth. "Let me tell you about the family, mother. The family has a new debt of gratitude to Ilara, a debt you could never comprehend." He reached into his jacket and pulled out not a weapon, but a single folded sheet of paper. He handed it to Ilara. It was a printout of a bank transfer confirmation. The amount was staggering. At the bottom, in the memo line, were 2 words: paid in full. As for Mr. Peterson, Dante continued, his voice never rising above a conversational tone, his company's recent bid for a city sanitation contract was brought to my attention. I found it lacking. I believe he will be pursuing other opportunities, in another state. He looked over at the terrified man, who gave a jerky nod and began to back away, melting into the crowd. Isabella stared, her face ashen. Her plan, so carefully constructed, was disintegrating before her eyes. He knew. He had known all along. She had not been a brilliant strategist. She had been a pawn in his game. You went behind my back, she stammered, her voice losing its imperious edge. No, mother, Dante corrected softly. You tried to go behind mine. You have forgotten the cardinal rule of this family. I see everything. I know everything. And I protect what is mine. This was the moment, the trap springing shut. But the true devastation was yet to come. You speak of worth, Dante said, his voice a low, devastating monologue that cut through the nearby chatter, drawing a small, powerful audience of onlookers. You speak of what a person brings to the table. For 40 years, you have been the family's accountant, a position of trust you inherited, not earned. So you have managed our legitimate holdings, our charities, the Obsidian Gala, your crown jewel. He paused, letting the words hang in the air. Isabella's face had gone from white to a mottled gray. It came to my attention recently that there were certain discrepancies in the ledgers, small amounts at first, skimmed from endowments, funneled into private accounts. You have been stealing from this family, mother, from your own son, for years. A collective gasp went through the small circle of listeners. This was more than a family squabble. This was a public execution. How? Isabella whispered, her voice a dry rasp. How could you possibly know? Dante turned and looked at Alara, his expression softening with a fierce, protective pride. Because you were careless, he said, his voice resonating with finality. You used an old ledger system for your private accounts, the same system my grandfather used, an archaic system full of codes and forgotten symbols that no modern accountant would ever recognize. He took Alara's hand, the one with the ring, and held it up. But you see, my fiancée, she is a restorer of old things. She is a scholar of the forgotten. She gives voice to things that have been silent for a long time. She didn't just restore my family's history. She audited yours. The full, horrifying truth dawned on Isabella's face. The ledger Alara had restored. It wasn't just a historical document. It was the key. The Rosetta Stone that allowed Dante to decipher his mother's betrayal. The strength went out of her legs, her carefully constructed world, her identity, her power. It all dissolved in a single, horrifying moment of revelation. She was not the queen. She was just a common thief, exposed by the very nobody she had sought to destroy. She dropped to her knees. A single, guttural sob escaped her lips, a raw animal sound of utter defeat. The eyes, but firmly, helped Isabella to her feet. She was sobbing uncontrollably now, a broken, ruined woman being escorted from her own life. The music in the grand hall had not stopped. The chatter from the far corners of the room continued unabated. But in their small corner of the universe, a dynasty had been unmade and a new one had been forged. Dante stood for a moment, watching the pathetic procession disappear. Then he turned back to Alara. The noise, the people, the entire glittering, hollow spectacle of the gala seemed to fade into the background. There was only her. He took her face in his hands, his thumbs gently brushing away tears she hadn't even realized she was crying. "It's over," he said softly. "You're safe." And in the ruins of Isabella Moretti's world, under the watchful eyes of the city's most powerful people, Ilara finally allowed herself to believe him. She leaned into his touch, a slow exhale escaping her lips. It was the first clean breath she had taken all night. The first of many. The great hall of the museum slowly emptied, the river of power and influence receding back into the city's hidden channels. The ice swan was beginning to melt, its elegant form blurring at the edges. Waitstaff moved with quiet efficiency, clearing away the debris of the evening. But Dante and Alara remained, standing in the center of the vast, quieted space. The storm had passed, leaving behind a profound and unnerving calm. Alara felt strangely light, as if a weight she had been carrying her entire life. The weight of being unseen, of being underestimated, of having to perpetually prove her own worth, had been lifted. The catharsis was so complete it left her feeling hollowed out, but clean. Dante had not let go of her hand. His thumb was making slow, steady circles on her skin, a grounding physical reassurance. He had not spoken since his mother had been led away. He was giving her space, letting her process. It was another of his quiet, unnerving competencies, his ability to understand what she needed before she did. Finally, he spoke, his voice low in the echoing space. "I apologize that you had to be a part of that." She looked up at him. The power and the danger were still there, etched into the lines of his face. But now she saw something else, too, a weariness, the cost of maintaining such absolute control. "You don't have to apologize to me, Dante," she said, her voice surprisingly strong. "You defended me. You validated me." "I stated the truth," he corrected. "Your value is intrinsic. It requires no validation from me or anyone else. I simply removed the people who were too blind to see it." It was the most romantic thing anyone had ever said to her. He gestured towards the grand staircase. "Come, there is something else." He led her up the stairs, their footsteps the only sound in the marble hall. He didn't lead her to the exit, but to a heavy set of oak doors she hadn't noticed before. He produced a key and unlocked them, revealing a dark, wood-paneled room. The museum director's office. Inside, a group of men were waiting. They were older, their suits conservative, their faces impassive. They all stood when Dante and Alara entered. Sir Ilara recognized two of them from the gala, a federal judge and the chairman of the city's largest bank. These were not Dante's soldiers. This was the other side of his power, the legitimate structural kind. "Gentlemen," Dante said, "thank you for waiting." He led Alara to the head of a long boardroom table and pulled out the chair for her. He did not take a seat himself, but stood behind her, his hands resting on the back of her chair. It was a position of deference and power all at once. He was presenting her. "Gentlemen," he began again, his voice carrying the weight of an edict. "There have been some administrative changes to the Moretti Family Foundation. As of tonight, my mother has retired from her position as head of the board. Her seat, and all the responsibilities that come with it, will be assumed by a new director." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the faces of the powerful men. "I would like to introduce you to Alara Vance, the new president and chief executive officer of the foundation. She has been the most capable person in every room she has ever entered. From now on, she will also be the most powerful. All foundation business will go through her. Her decisions are final. Her word is mine." A stunned silence filled the room. Alara felt her own heart stop. This was beyond protection. This was beyond validation. This was enthronement. He wasn't just giving her a shield. He was giving her an army, a kingdom. The bank chairman was the first to recover. He looked at Alara, at the quiet intelligence in her eyes, at the unshakable man standing behind her. He had not survived this long in this city by backing the wrong horse. He gave a slow, respectful nod. "Madam President," he said, "it is an honor. We look forward to working with you." One by one, the others followed suit, their expressions shifting from shock to acceptance to deference. The power in the room had been recalibrated, a new order established, not with a bang, but with Dante's quiet, declarative sentences. Later, they stood on the museum's rooftop terrace, a private space overlooking the glittering expanse of the city. The cold night air was a welcome shock after the charged atmosphere of the last few hours. The city lights spread out below them like a carpet of fallen stars. Ilara leaned against the cold stone balustrade, the silence between them comfortable now, familiar. She finally felt like she could breathe again. Saw a slow, deep breath that reached all the way to the bottom of her lungs. A real smile, one that reached her eyes, finally found its way to her lips. It was a smile of peace, of rightness. "You've had a busy night," she said, her voice laced with an irony that felt new and good. "Toppling a matriarch, installing a new CEO. "It was an evening of necessary corrections," he said, coming to stand beside her. He wasn't looking at the city, but at her. He reached into his pocket and his hand emerged not with a velvet box, but with the sapphire ring. Her ring. He had slipped it off her finger at some point during the chaotic aftermath without her even noticing. He held it in his open palm. "I told you this was a shield, not a cage," he said, his voice serious. "The threat from my mother is neutralized. You no longer require its protection. See, the position with the Foundation is yours, unconditionally. Your safety is guaranteed. You are free to go, Ilara, free to build the life you want, with the resources you deserve. The ring has served its purpose." She looked at the ring, gleaming in the moonlight. She thought about walking away. She could. She could take the power, the resources, and build a life for herself, far from this dangerous, complicated man. A life of quiet work, of safety earned and owned by her alone. But then she thought of his face when he spoke of her competence, the quiet pride, the unnerving way he saw right to the core of her. She thought of the loneliness in his eyes, the isolation of the man who sees everything. She thought about a life without that quiet, intense presence. And for the first time, the thought of being alone felt not like freedom, but like an absence. She did not take the ring. Instead, she held out her left hand. "The first time was a statement of fact," she said softly, meeting his gaze. "A strategic adjustment. This time, it needs to be a question." A slow, profound understanding dawned in his eyes. The impassive mask of Dante Moretti, the quiet sovereign, finally fell away, revealing the man underneath. A man who had just risked his entire world on a woman he barely knew, and was now facing the terrifying possibility of her answer. He took her hand. His fingers trembled just slightly. It was the most human gesture she had ever seen him make. He slid the ring back onto her finger. It felt different this time. Not a weight, but an anchor. Not a shield, but a promise. "Ilara Vance," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "Say you are the most intelligent, capable, and honest person I have ever known. You have brought order to my chaos and truth to my history. Will you do me the honor of building a future with me? Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, the word simple, absolute, and entirely her own. "Yes, Dante, I will." The future was not a happily ever after. It was not an ending. It was a beginning, a what comes next. It would be a life built not on fairy tales, but on something far more real and resilient. A partnership of equals, a family forged from honesty, complication, and the quiet, daily choice to stay. As she looked out over the city, his hand holding hers, she knew there would be other battles, other storms, but she would no longer be facing them alone. She was no longer a nobody. She was his somebody. And he, she was beginning to realize, was hers.